Hello everyone, welcome to In the Studio. Today we're talking about sub bass. So let's define sub bass first. Okay, so sub bass can be classified as anything below around the 60 hertz area. That's a general rule. And unlike other genres of music, like for instance rock, which has one single bass element, the bass guitar, club tracks often have multiple bass tracks. One playing the mid top bass, which you really hear on a club system, and the sub bass down low is something that you feel in your chest and don't hear it so much. So I want to just talk about some do's, some don'ts, some things to consider when you're working with sub bass. So while we're talking about club systems, a general rule of thumb is to um, program or stay above the E1 or don't go below the E1 mark or around 40 hertz. Um, the club systems, depending on the system or rig, start rolling off around 30 to 45 hertz. So if you go below 40 hertz, it's probably not going to be audible anyways, and it's just going to eat up your headroom and probably muddy up your mix. So that's just a general kind of rule of thumb there. And I mean, yeah, these are frequencies that you're not going to hear on an iPod. You're not going to hear them on a laptop speaker. Even like decent like home speakers don't accurately represent frequencies up to even 100 hertz. So when you're working with sub bass, it can be a little bit tricky sometimes, but I recommend referencing your track against a track that you know works well in the club, um, and use a frequency analyzer as well to kind of help you, because even decent studio monitors will kind of roll off around that 60 hertz mark. So yeah, it can be a tricky little beast, but necessary to give that club oomph that we all love. So I have this little demo here for the demonstration today. And you can see in my bass track, I mean, there's already sub bass frequencies in there. And there's a couple ways to go about creating sub bass for your track. So you can either, if your bass is synthesized, you can mix in a sub oscillator an octave or two below, the rest of your bass. Or if you have a open oscillator that you're not using, you can grab a sine wave or triangle wave and pitch that down a couple octaves and do it that way. But more often than not, I prefer to split my bass into multiple frequency bands. That'll give me more control, and it will open up some creative possibilities as well. So that's what I want to show you here. That's what we're going to do to this bass. Because I mean, it already has sub bass in there, so I don't need more sub bass. But what I want is more control. So let's do that really quick. I'm going to clone this bass track, which is an instance of Massive. I'm going to copy this MIDI track down like so. I'm going to put this on its own mixer insert, and on this bass track here, I'm going to initialize a new patch, and I'm going to select just a sine wave. So I mentioned you could use a sine wave, or a triangle would work too if you want a little bit of harmonics in there. A triangle would be okay, but I usually go for a sine wave. You want a clean, pure tone. If you use a saw wave or pulse wave or square wave, they're too harmonically rich. They're going to clash with the mid top bass, and that's not what we're after here. So I'm going to grab a sine wave, I'm going to pitch it down 1 octave so it's playing an octave below the other one. Alright, great. Let's hear that. Okay, cool. So what we need to do is split this into 2 frequency bands. So we need to do a little bit of EQing. So on the sub bass track, I'm going to make a low pass and cut it. Maybe around that 150 mark, I think will be okay. And then on the top bass, oops, I'm going to cut around 100 hertz. You generally want a little bit of overlap. Sometimes if you use like a really steep curve, like like a 48 dB per octave slope, you get some awkward little frequency gaps between the sub bass and the top bass. So I generally like to leave a little bit of an overlap between the two. So I think that will work. So this is great. So now what this does, it allows me to keep the sub bass mono, and I have a separate volume control for it, and then I can also add some effects to the top mid bass without affecting the sub bass. So maybe I probably want to sidechain the sub bass as well, and then you do have the option to, like, for instance, sidechain the sub bass more aggressively than the mid top bass if you wanted to. And I generally don't really do much processing on the sub bass at all, just maybe some sidechain and an EQ, and that's it. And then on the top bass, what we can do is maybe add a little bit of distortion. Maybe you can run that through some delay, maybe give it a little touch of chorus. This one already has some reverb on it. It's built, or there's reverb already set up on this patch here, but you can add some reverb. And again, it's not going to affect our sub bass, our sub bass. So yeah, that's what I wanted to go over today. A little bit of sub bass discussion, some do's, some don'ts, some mixing techniques, using multiple bands for more control and flexibility. Hopefully you learned something here. Leave me a comment, question, and I'll catch everyone later. Cheers. Oh, and one other thing. You don't always have to copy down the same exact part or have the same MIDI pattern with your sub bass. You could, this is not as common of a technique, but you could make a separate pattern just for the sub bass and have it playing a very simple pattern underneath the main bass, and that is an option as well. Cheers.